Hey,
Welcome once
Facebook.
more to the always not awkward beginning to the Outcast Intellectual Podcast. And if you've watched this a few times, you definitely recognize Chrislyn, who has indulged me with these multiple hour-long conversations before. Um, but yeah, this time, uh, I don't know like where I got the idea, but I mean, as I've made it clear in other episodes, like I'm not a fan of popular psychology, or that's what I call it anyway. Um, because I think it would be kind of dumb to say like I don't like psychology. You know what I mean? Because I don't have a problem with psychology. I have an issue with how it's predominantly handled within the field of psychology as a practice and such. Um, and since Chrislyn actually has been a psychologist, it seemed relevant. Um,
Yeah. This is always
and
fun to me because I never got challenged like this when I was a psychologist. We all pretty much had the same like viewpoint on things. So when we have these conversations and you come at it and challenge those sort of uh, well established things from that field, it's always very interesting.
I mean, that's the funny thing about it is that, like, psychology is supposed to be a science pretty much, right?
Yeah.
So every other science, and this is another reason why I don't really have as much uh, trust in psychologists when it comes to the application of certain methods, is that as soon as a human has to perceive a human, could be themselves, could be somebody else, it naturally is going to. I mean, it's going to, anything would involve it, but particularly with humans, there's going to be that bias. And, it's why freaking Dr. Phil was a marriage counselor, psychologist, whatever it was. And yet he got divorced. Like, it's like people are imperfect. They're not robots. They don't know all the answers. It doesn't matter if they went to school and paid lots of money to go to school and yes, like got a good education on something like that. They're still just people. And yeah, you would think that as a scientific discipline, psychology, like most others at least, would constantly be trying to evolve its understanding, you know?
I think it is, but I also think psychology is a super young field. Like it's not been around as long
Pun
as like
intended.
yeah,
Super
ha
young.
ha ha. Young with a J. Yeah, love that.
Yes.
That's really good. That was really good fun.
Kind of
Um,
funny.
uh, but like when you look at it from that perspective of how it's been around maybe 150 years max if you really are pushing it.
Mhm.
And we didn't really start doing any kind of like genuine experimentation for learning more about things until, you know, fairly recently. So then the other thing that I like to consider too is that like, and we're going to get into this, but like when we're diagnosing certain psychological illnesses, we use the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual Fifth Edition. Oh, my brain just farted out. Basically, it's like the gold standard, and it tells you all the different things you need to have in order to have like any autism or ADHD or whatever. But that's been revised 5 times, and I don't know when the first one came out, but like at this point, it's being revised pretty much every 20 years. So like just 2 versions ago, they still had homosexuality as a mental illness. So
Right.
when you're like thinking of that, it does kind of put it in perspective. But I can completely see what you're saying from your perspective, basically because homosexuality was in there just 2 versions ago, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, it's not an exact science. I do think they use, I don't think, I know we use scientific methods, but there's so much subjectivity to all of this.
Mhm.
And until we can like, until they just develop how they're looking at things and what we know more, I just think we're going to fall in this category where we have people who are skeptics and rightfully so.
Yeah, and the thing when it comes to that is that Uh, yeah, I mean, there's bound to be that micro change, like, study to study. What does this say? What does that say? I guess what I should have been clear on is in terms of the macro, because like people are still like, if a cop shoots somebody and it's on like video and it's wrong, wrongful, whatever they would be called, then there's some kind of process to try to get them to be held responsible. Whether or not they are is an entirely different discussion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but if like if a child goes into a psychologist's office and they are diagnosed as this or that, then that's just how it's considered to be. And even if the psychologists were wrong, because the child is now like, there's this big authority figure that's like, its job is to say this is what's wrong with you. Like, people try to act like that's not what it's saying, but that really is the message that is being sent, despite all the politically correct language that's being used. And so you have what is ultimately a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense, in many cases, where it's like, even if like the psychologist was just wrong in their diagnosis, the child could end up reflecting that as a belief of adopting that identity. And so what you have is a situation where somebody can literally alter the course of somebody's entire life. And what happens, later on, if the child, you know, grows up to be a person and realizes, wait, that person was full of shit. And I spent all
Yeah.
these years, basically living out this false reality that they had envisioned, which can be influenced by the natural bias of human perception. Because you can go to college and you can take the test and you can complete your lab hours without overcoming like your personal biases and things like that.
Oh, a
You know,
million percent. Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that like is supposed to be within the ethics when you become a psychologist, is that within our ethics, you're supposed to be aware or trying to become more aware of implicit biases that you have so that
right.
you can understand how your decision making may be influenced by them, right? But like
Mhm.
to your point, the idea of getting a label, especially as a child, that's psychological, has massive impact. Like you're saying, this self-fulfilling prophecy, like a million percent, yes. Which is why, we used to call low IQ mental retardation. We don't phrase it like that anymore. We call it intellectual disability, but most people would understand it as mental retardation. Yeah, I know, not as fun. But the cutoff for that is 70, an IQ of 70. So, first of all, IQ tests are supposed to, they are not supposed to, they are very standardized. You're supposed to read the directions a certain way and score them a very certain way so that if somebody gave the same test, the same kid that wasn't you, you'd get the same score. That's a perfect world. We don't live in a perfect world. No matter
Right.
who, I would love to talk to any psychologist that gives IQ tests and have them argue with this point. But there are sometimes when you're getting an answer that doesn't fit super perfectly, and you're going to have to decide if it's this amount of points or that amount of points. So just there alone, there's subjectivity, right? And so when you get a score, let's say I get a score 71 for this kid, right? We also have confidence intervals, which those are supposed to sort of account for like if the kid was tired that day, or like if they just didn't friggin' feel like being there. Like, we know there are days where we're peak performance and not. So the confidence interval gives us, like, if you retested this kid, we're 95% confident that that 71 you got would actually fall somewhere between like 67 and like 74. Let's just say. So what am I supposed to do as a professional? Do I say this child is mentally retarded and we need to provide services for them to help them equally access their rights as an American, but also I give them that label for their whole life? Or do I say no? And obviously this is a small section of this disability. Like, I'm not going to launch into the whole thing of what that whole process would look like. But it's a great question because you're talking about a self-fulfilling prophecy. My brother is autistic and bipolar, very, very smart, but zero confidence. And his biggest thing is he thinks he's a retard. Like, where did he get that? Where did he get that from?
Probably, yeah, I would imagine probably because he's limited in ways that many others value. And rather than understanding that he's also exceptional in ways others value, and just basically chalking it up to, my strength stat is at 9 and my agility is at 3.
Right,
Because, well, because my agility is not at 9, to use a gaming example, that means that I'm a waste.
That's a really great, I actually love that analogy. If I was still working in schools with kids, I would absolutely like draw out like a game character like that. That's brilliant, actually. Thank you for that idea. I'll tell my old coworkers about it. But yes, it's a great point. And what you were saying before too, you touched on, was I don't remember how you phrased it, but essentially like we're saying you're disabled. Like whoever the we is are saying that you're wrong. There's something wrong with you. And that's not entirely true. If you just maybe don't function the way the majority of people do. But everybody's got something that I don't think anyone's a 100% typical person. That would be pretty rare, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me, and like the reason why, the episode is titled to focus on like, disorder or like peak, survival, is because, and this is where I divert in general, I don't know, I want to say ideology, but perception of like these different disorders from popular psychology, is that at its essence, I see every single one of these things as the body seeking to adapt to an environment. And the reality of evolution is that it is not pretty, because nature doesn't care about pretty. Nature doesn't care if animals are crapping in the forest so you can't take your picture, or if the gorillas are screwing when you're at the zoo so it's not fun for the whole family. You know what I mean? Like, nature does not need to be pretty while it's making things happen. But that just offends the human general sensibility and desire for comfort, which is another reason why I don't really have, it's people in general are just limited by their main priority, honestly, often being comfort.
Oh, 1,000,000%. Yeah.
Rather than growth or the truth or perception or, whatever it is. And so, like, yes, maybe your child evolved in a certain way that will completely cripple them for the rest of their lives because the body mutated in a given way to try something new. And that is something so detached that makes us feel so unimportant that people can't consider that. And I mean, it's the same thing as how people, couldn't accept that lightning was caused by the atmosphere, above us, the climate and such. And so it had to be an angry god. And so for me, modern day popular psychology is largely the modern religion, and to some extent, I mean, I think it would be multiple religion. It would be a polytheistic religion, right? Because you would have like the states and you would also have that. But ultimately, the way I look at it is that people bring their mythology and such to psychology. And, it's like, it's impossible to say that like Hitler was just really fucking wrong. He can't just be a dude who had like a really bad fucking temper who's also German, and who like the countries around Germany fucked Germany over, and everybody was anti-Semitic back then, except they don't want to admit that. They just want to put it on the Germans so that they don't need to take any responsibility for it. And now like Hitler is just the definition of evil. And it's like, I'm not, this is not about talking about Hitler in specific. It's about the fact that like people perceive something and they decide that they emotionally, as we know as marketers, they hate it or they fear it. But if that's like me, that means I could be like that too.
Well, that's the distinction here. And I think too, there is a fine line when we're talking in this way between psychology and sociology. Honest to God, if I could go back and do it again, I'm like slightly more interested in sociology than
Yeah.
psychology. But from a psychological and sociological standpoint, Hitler's super interesting. So are school shooters. So are serial killers. What the hell is happening in this group of people that's making them have such extreme erratic behaviors? And why was Hitler so successful? There's like, the social psychology aspect of it. He was a bad dude, but millions of people did what this bad dude said. And how did he get into the position where he could do that? So like that's the part that like I think becomes interesting. Not necessarily what was it about him that was fucked up, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
Right. But the thing is that, like, for example, we use drones to blow up sites that are suspected of terrorist activity.
Yeah.
Oh, it turned out it was just like a family that, whatever, but collateral damage, right?
Yeah.
So in our cases, it's collateral damage. But if you viewed it, it's the same thing as like that paper of like Narsarima or however you would say it. It was basically it was like a study of like an ethnic people, but it was phrased in like the most foreign way possible, but it was actually about Americans.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think I vaguely
Yeah.
remember that where was there a part where they talked about how they put their heads in ovens and they were referring to like dryers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like filling their teeth with mercury and
yes,
like
yes,
embedding things in their skin. Yeah. And
yeah,
so for me, it's like, again, and this is very much the macro, but I feel like it's important to establish the macro before going into the micro, where like people can look at this situation like with the Nazis and just be like, oh, like they were evil. But it's like that's just childish. Like I don't believe in evil. It's just it's what the hell is it supposed to be? It's bad. What is bad?
well,
Like what in nature, like, so the thing for me is that for something to become what modern people would call evil is just for a variety of factors to build up and have like kind of this poke through point, and that's an example. So it's like using Hitler as this example, like he felt that way. But if you also go back through like his history, like he also, for example, was blinded at one point by I think like a mustard gas attack or something like that. And like he actually had like I don't remember if they thought that he had like some sort of like psychological blindness or something after the fact. But anyway, like he went through a number of situations leading up to all those other things, even just the fact that like he wanted to be a painter, and like a lot of people say like when they look at it nowadays, like yeah, they were actually pretty good, but he was just rejected from that. Probably family, like there were probably so many factors that happened in his life, but people would rather just write it off as, oh, it's something with his brain.
right,
Because again, like it's the same thing with Charles Manson.
right,
Watch a fucking interview with Charles Manson, and it's kind of hard to say that he wasn't crazy, right?
yeah,
But the thing is like, I remember watching even just a freaking a YouTube video on his life, and like the life that he lived, like when he was young, would fuck up the vast majority of people. And so I think that largely the disorder kind of perspective and the sickness and the this and the that is largely just a way of society throwing stones at given people so that everybody else can feel like I'm not like them, or that I could never become them. But to use, I think it was I'm not like big into comics or whatever, but I think the Joker once said to Batman, it's like, it's like you can beat up as many people and throw them in prison as you want, but at the end of the day, you know that the only difference between you and me is one bad day.
yeah.
And so I think that that's a big factor for that. I don't want to just monologue, so yeah.
No, I like honestly, I kind of want to go back to another thing that you were talking about earlier, which is the idea that there's like some kind of worship going on in psychology. You were like mentioning that it's like almost theistic, right?
Yeah.
And if you look back at the last 100 years, we started with Freud. Freud was like, let's talk about Oedipus and how you wanna kill your dad and fuck your mom. Like, what? How did? First of all, very much feels like you made that up. Second of all, doesn't feel scientific at all. Like, yeah. So I don't. I also think that disorders change within societal context, right? Like, is something a disorder here and not in a different society? Um,
So is it a disorder at all then, if the
right.
society is what decides whether it's a disorder or not? Because if it's an inherent characteristic of of you, then there is no element of it. Like if the society decides that, then if you go into the forest, you no longer have a disorder.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, and I think that's where we really come down to like severities of disorders. But I think the farther you go into the severity of a mental disorder, you're also now going into like a physical or physiological issue, right? So exceptions to this would be like we don't really refer to it like this anymore, but just for everyone else, it's like low functioning autism, where people are very nonverbal, or have autism in addition to low IQ and have trouble functioning. Where if they went out in the woods, they would probably die.
Right.
But aside from like those type of severe cases, which I think, well, I don't think I know, are very much a small percentage of what we're talking about when we talk about psychology and diagnosis. Because what are the largest group of people when we're talking about this, right? It's like people with ADHD, people with anxiety,
Mhm.
depression, PTSD, people who are mainly functioning in society but with trouble because of X. Does
Right.
that like sort of like when you think psychology, is that sort of summarizing the largest population of who you're thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me is that I see the vast majority of people as being, and that is a reason why I always found it kind of like hypocritical, is that the vast majority of people are fucked up. Like you say,
Yeah.
they don't not diagnosed with ADHD or ODD or ADD or this DD or that BC or whatever the fuck acronym they decided to use to label this thing. Most people spend their entire lives doing things they don't like for money they don't think is enough, spending it with people that they don't actually like, but don't have the self-respect to tell off, and so on and so on. They don't, they don't care enough about themselves to be in shape, et cetera, et cetera. If you looked at that, like, like the Narcerim or however, you're supposed to say it from that perspective, that external perspective, I do not buy that people would not find that disordered or mentally
Yeah.
handicapped or something.
Well,
And so,
that's the thing is we are in a super unnatural environment at all times. Our brains aren't wired for this. Are you
right.
freaking kidding? Um, I just this is another piece of the puzzle that I think it's way too hard to parse out when you're trying to look at how do we understand the brain and when it is a disorder and when it's not and what we do about it. That's the other part you and I have talked about. Great, you have a disorder. What the fuck do you do about it? How do you actually problem solve through this? Because there's not, as a psychologist, there's not super great answers to a lot of things.
Right. And
Um,
as we were talking about, like with you last night, like if, that you had the anxiety about the one project that you know and understand or whatever and such. But like if you try to just bring that to like a typical like, like therapist or whatever, like that they may be completely useless in helping you like operationally feel better in the moment. Like it might be about like fundamentally changing this, or why do you think you feel that or whatever. It's like it's not, we're not doing anthropology here. We're trying to make sure that a building doesn't fall down. Okay.
right.
Like we can talk about the design elements of it once we've kept it from collapsing on itself.
Well, and that's a really good point. I mean, I remember going to my therapist, who I no longer see, but I was working two jobs. I was a full-time student and I had just gotten engaged. And I decided I wanted to get married within 2 months because I was insane. But I remember going to her and being like, this is too much. Every single day is like fucking crazy and I want to just yeet myself off a building. Not really, so like don't call anyone. But you know,
I
I
wouldn't.
was
That's your
right.
choice.
Right. Well, I meant her, like the
Oh,
therapist.
okay, good.
But I remember her looking at me and being like, well, we can do nothing about this right now. So how can we prevent it in the future? And I was like,
I
I
need to
mean,
make
I don't know what I was expecting her to tell me, you know? Like she was right in the sense that like I had put myself in that shit. I had made all the decisions that led to that point, but and like I guess the best way to problem solve at that point was like, okay, why did you fucking put yourself here? And how are you not going to do it again? But like you're saying, there wasn't a there's not a good how do you fucking deal with what you're in exactly in this moment is a lot
Yeah.
harder to navigate. Plus we all react to things so differently, so having
Yeah.
blanket statements for any kind of reaction or behavior is really tough, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you and I are going to react to something very differently even if it's the same exact thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's again, life is always trying to adapt this in some way. And whatever, like even if it's like you could even say that like you working to make more money is you trying to adapt to being able to make the life you want happen. You know what I mean? And of course, like everybody could say it's like, okay, well, then you could look at it a different way, but it's like life down to the bacteria and whatever else, it is trying to adapt. And again, contrary to what people would like to think, there doesn't have to be some divine plan that's guiding everything, because things make mistakes and then things die and then things feed other things and then those things feed other things, which means that there are unlimited numbers of tries.
Right.
So
I
there's
laugh. I
yeah.
laugh because it feels brutal, but that's because we're very sensitive and think we're important. And you kind of brought that up before. It's
Right,
not
exactly.
brutal. It's just the way nature is.
Yeah, it's indifferent.
Yeah.
and
Yes.
and people cannot stand, and people as a whole cannot stand to consider that they may not have any inherent value that is different from anything else.
Yeah.
And
It's
like for
icky.
me, yeah, for me, I was always just like, well, I don't care. Like I decide my own value. There you go. You know, it's like I don't need somebody else to tell me that I have value. I'll decide it for myself. But to not go philosophical with it, my point being is that ultimately, kind of what we've touched on is that a disorder is just a word for a trait somebody has that is not benefiting them now and could arguably generally inconvenience them in other situations as well. I think I said it before, is like to me, a disorder is basically just a character trait that limits options. Like just to be like the essence of it. Like I know there was a lot to unpack with it, but I think that that's probably the closest because again, it's tied into adaptation again.
I think that's a really fair assessment. I would say my thought for what a disorder is something that interferes with your ability to participate in a typical everyday life. Like whatever's going on is interfering with your ability to do that.
See, for me, again, it comes back to assuming a given context of everyday life.
Right, because now I'm assuming what your life looks like, right?
Right.
Um, but like to like sort of backtrack to like the title of the podcast, right? Where we're talking about disorders versus your brain just performing in a way that's supposed to save you.
Right.
That
Yeah.
and I think that's fascinating when you think about it, because if you look at charts that show dominant mental health disorders and like surges in such things, we see incredible spikes in certain disorders over like the last 30 or 40 years.
Like
And
ADHD and stuff.
ADHD, autism has increased like rapidly. Anxiety and depression is like friggin'. Who do you know that doesn't have either some anxiety or depression? Like that group of people is smaller than the group of people with it at this point.
Well, and when did it become a medical condition to experience anxiety in that sense? Because it's like when you consistently reinforce a pace that is above like the natural rhythms and put way too much pressure on something that honestly does not matter, it is not insane for something to become hyperactive or hyper vigilant, one might say. It is insane to expect otherwise.
Yeah, like I love my job and I'm happy to do this podcast. But if you look at it from a natural perspective, I am sitting my ass in this chair in front of a fucking screen that lights up and shows me pictures that move for
Right.
like 7 hours straight. And if we're looking at this from the however you say that word, narcissist,
Yeah,
whatever.
the Narcerima. I don't even know if I was
Yeah,
saying it right, but yeah.
it's America backwards, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're looking at it from, if you're an alien and you're like, oh, this isn't how any other natural mammal being on this planet does anything. Like maybe the sloths. It's like, no. It's unnatural. It's not. What are
Sorry.
you doing? Oh, it's funny. But it's not. And like you'll find these weird, wacky studies that are like, yeah, studies show that if you just put your bare feet on the bare ground for 30 minutes a day, your anxiety levels go down.
Yeah.
Really? Oh, you're saying if you just don't do the shit that's driving us all insane, you feel
Right.
better? But I gotta tell you, I know that information, and I can't tell you the last time that I went and put my feet on the ground to solve my anxiety problem, right? Like,
Right.
even when we know what can help us, sometimes we still don't even go do it
Right.
because it either doesn't fit into our day or it's too uncomfortable.
Because we're
Or,
fucking animals.
yeah,
Like we're not in this is the thing where it's like people create this false reality in their minds where it's like we are these special things. And again, like I like to be respectful of people who are respectful. And so while I consider the the accounts of history and such presented in religious works and learning to be tactful in my older age,
I love that.
well, I personally consider it to be mythology. I
Mhm.
don't want to dismiss it because, like somebody could be like completely on board and like be with us and such, and they shouldn't get expelled from the point simply because I don't like agree with what they believe. So that's how I see it. But to me, it's a mythology that people are trying to maintain, where it's like it's the same thing as like if you get into an argument with your significant other, whoever it happens to be in a given situation, it's like that they're in the wrong. No, you don't. Your body is flooded with chemicals that are designed to deal with the conflict. That's it. And then they go away and you're like,
I feel stupid. Yeah.
shit.
Yeah, done fucked up. Yeah.
It's like, oh, like I value this person. They've always been there for me. They love me. We're married, and you're like, I just basically told them like they're a worthless piece of shit. I wish I dated their friend instead.
We didn't say that. But like, why did we do that? That's the other part. Like when we come back to like your brain being in survival mode. Like,
Right.
Why did you have that emotional reaction? Why are people getting anxiety and depression? Why is ADHD a thing? Like, it's not because we're breaking. To your point, it's probably because we're trying to adapt, and
Exactly.
we're throwing whatever we can at a wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah.
So there's something about these disorders that we're seeing spikes in that are an adaptive feature, or at least are trying to be. And especially in the case of autism, right? Like when we look at like what are the markers of autism, aside from like some of the more severe cases of like echolalia, when like they repeat certain words over and over again, or phrases, or like I memorize
over and over again.
I memorize the credits to every TV show I've ever watched, and I can tell them to you. Like aside from that kind of stuff, other things that we see are like a very literal interpretation of language, like social differences, and like you have to think when that's the case, and we live in a world where you can text and email, and how many times have you sent a message and the wrong tone was inferred?
Right. Or perceived.
Right.
It's like it's like a game of telephone. Like there's what you meant to say, there's how you said it, there's how it would come across, there's how a given person would receive anything, there's how they would perceive that. Like there's so many different factors from
So with autism, there's kind of like blinders on, where it's like, no, I wrote exactly what I meant. Right? I sent you an email and I wrote exactly what I meant. There's no need to interpret it like any further. That was the thing. And I'm going to read your email exactly as you wrote it and not be like, oh, was that like a fun thing? Or you know what I mean? Like there's something, there's a beauty in that simplicity. And this is just
Right.
one example of one characteristic of autism.
Yeah.
But the ADHD, oh, go hard, go hard, go hard.
It's almost like it's what we're being told to do all day long, all life long. You know,
Don't spend too much time on any one thing because there are several million things you need to do.
right.
And we're shocked that this is becoming an issue.
And again, it's one of those things, which is why I think I almost feel like if the more you get interested in psychology, inevitably you're going to become more interested in sociology, because if you're smart, if your IQ is above 70, no, like, if you're an inquisitive person, then you're naturally going to start seeing that like these things are biased, that they are being affected by the overall perception of society rather than a pure objective understanding of human nature, behavior, whatever. And that is when you cannot start seeing that, first of all, disorders are just something that a society is saying for the vast majority of the time. It's just saying that you are stuck being this way or whatever. And that's something that we know is, and have more and more evidence is the case, is that they used to think that you were born this way. Then it was a gene that got activated. Now it's a gene that gets activated and you can deactivate it. And so that stuff, like, people are realizing like you're not even stuck with it, but psychologists as a whole are still not telling people this. So they think that they're just stuck with it forever. But then you have just like the whole thing of like, society gets to make you feel as little as possible,
Oh,
but the mirror never gets turned around. You know what I mean?
yeah.
And because it's just a big apparatus. And exactly like you said, like, I think about the job market. You don't want to be a generalist generally. You know what I mean? Like, particularly with normal jobs, like with marketing, like, yeah, like there's a little bit more flexibility, but like with jobs, you want to be really good at one thing so that you stand out amongst everybody else. Who you are as a person doesn't matter. You don't need to be super sociable, but you need to be super specialized. It's almost like there's a given group of people who tend to be very good at one thing, and they're socially not that, well developed, but as long as they're okay, then people don't care, because people don't care who you are as a person anyway. So it'd be kind of funny if it turned out that all these disorders are basically physically showing us like the lack in society itself, because society doesn't care who you are or how you feel or how you interpret things. It only cares if you do your job.
This is a super good point, and it also kind of makes me think of, first of all, when we're like talking about developmental disorders, like, or not developmental disorders, but disorders that occur during like your formative years, right? That we're identifying while you're like a kid. What are you doing? What's your job when you're a kid?
To be a kid.
No, to go to school.
Oh,
Your
well, yeah.
job's to go to school. And school is a very specific environment.
Right.
It's not necessarily the same environment you're going to see as an employee, right? But if you don't fit into that very specific environment, you are disordered. Like, and that was my job. You don't fit into this environment. How can I help adapt your environment to make you fit here? Because you have to fit, because the government told me you had to. And it's my job to figure that out. What is wrong with you, and how do I fix it for you?
Right.
And the more I worked in public schools, the more I ended up really not identifying with that process on a personal level. Like, I would not send my kids to public school, and that is not because I think they're terrible or anything. I just think they're unrealistic.
Yeah.
I think it's unrealistic for me to expect a kid, like a lot of what I was asking these kids to do, they'd ask me why, and I wouldn't have a good answer. Why do I need to learn this math shit that I am never going to use, and I have a calculator in the internet in my pocket my whole life? And like past your times tables and like basic math shit, I couldn't give them an answer.
Like, what if you don't have your phones? Like, people always
No,
have their
somebody,
phone.
your buddy has their phone. It's cool.
Right.
Trust me, right? Like, I don't need to know the quadratic equation ever.
Sure.
I can't tell you how to find the circumference of a circle. I would Google it. like, point being, they'd ask me like, why the fuck do I have to do this? Because you have to. And
Right.
the only good answer I had was that like someday you're going to be in a job where you're going to have to do something that doesn't make sense and you have to do it because it's your job. And they would retort, but I'm not getting paid right now. And I'm like, yeah, it's also, you know what I mean? Like, so
Well, well met.
there was just,
Touche.
there's a lot, like, also, if I don't want a job where I sit at a desk for 7 hours a day, because that's not the kind of person I am and I need to be moving, maybe I become a landscaper. Maybe I design fucking golf courses. I don't know. Like,
Right.
but I wouldn't pick that job because I'm not good at that and my brain doesn't operate like that.
Right.
So it's all of this to say we start kids off in an environment where it's like you better sink or swim, and if you sink you're wrong, and you're going to carry that wrong with you forever.
And you're
Oh,
going to
you're
sink because you don't swim exactly the way we say, not because you can't
right.
swim at all, but you didn't swim the right way.
Just like when you were talking about like building your video game character, right? I give this character a 9 in math and a 1 in reading, and now they think they're fucking stupid.
Yeah.
And that's the truth, because now we have to send them to a different classroom for reading, and all their friends see them go to that classroom and they go, "Oh my god,
Right.
did you see that? Isaac has to go to that room for reading." Like this.
Right. And
Oh,
even if they try to be nice about it, like the person still feels a given way because now they can't be with the people they want to be with. They have to be with this group of people, and like they're going to be focusing on like the most, disadvantaged, whatever you want to say, like the person who's least capable, like cognitively available, to put it in modern terminology.
yeah,
And so they're going to be comparing themselves and identifying with this new group that they're in too. Like there are
yeah,
a lot of different factors beyond even just, oh, now I'm not in normal class anymore.
yeah. Or like, let's say, same kid, right, in science class. Hey, Isaac, can you read the next section of the chapter for us? And you're like, we're in
Yeah,
science, man. This was not how I saw this going. And
right.
so now let's talk about self-fulfilling prophecies. Even though that kid's great at math, do you think they fucking like school?
No.
So they're probably not going to play to that strength ever. They don't give a fuck that they're good at math. They want to get out of that building as fast as they can. And I don't blame them.
And even if they could develop a skill that just didn't develop as naturally as another one, now they will be de-incentivized. I don't know if that's a word, but it is now, to even bother trying, because now they hate being there. So they don't even want to be in the location, which arguably would be the best place for them to learn how to do the thing better that they are not currently gifted at or whatever. You know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
a situation that not only do they feel like less of a person because they can't do a given thing well, but the situation it creates and like the state of mind that it encourages actively discourages the process that would help fix everything for them, like as an individual. I mean, the school system would still be fucked, but they at least would be a little bit better then. And it's like, to like use like another example, a more positive example than, I don't know, Hitler. Um, yeah, like Bruce Lee,
Yeah.
Famous martial artist actor. His nickname as a kid was Never Sit Still.
Yes.
Did he have ADHD? I don't know. He was literally like the person who was responsible for turning Asians in cinema from just being those ratty math people, accountants, to martial artists. I don't know about you, but if I'm going to be like written off as either being like this hideous like accountant, or I'm going to be a badass martial artist, like, you know what I mean? Like so it's like, and it also is similar to my pal Adam, who like he says he's autistic and that it's his superpower.
Yeah.
And so it goes back to like, it is not a fucking disorder. It is a characteristic. And if you look at it the right way, the vast majority of people will be able to look at the way that they are as just how they are and figure out how to make it a strength.
Yeah.
Because
that's what we should be encouraging, right? Like,
not in a bullshit like positivity way, like a real practical way. Like, oh no, you're fine. You'll be fine. Like you don't need to feel, but like, no, like you can focus on something for 6 hours. Most people can't focus on things for 25 minutes. This is a strength, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
And that's like back to the public schools, because I do think this is really important. Because like, what percentage of, if you don't even look at them as kids, just look at them as small humans.
Right?
What percentage of small humans are in this exact same environment leading up to being like normal humans? Like fucking 99% of them, or something ridiculous like that.
Mm.
And I don't want to demonize public schools either, because I think a lot of really good people work in them and are trying very hard. But the
I mean, the
structure,
institution can be corrupted without
that's what
putting
it
it
is,
on
though.
the staff members.
That it really is what it comes down to, because there's limitations there. There's federally, or not federally, but like there's like the approved curriculum you can use, and the
Right.
learning outcomes they want every student to have, and
Common Core.
no student left behind. And it's like, you're not leaving anyone behind. I mean, maybe some shitty districts were, but like, I'm not leaving you behind if you have a super strength in something and a super weakness in something else, and we focus very differently on your education.
Right.
And that kind of flexibility doesn't really exist. And these teachers don't have the fucking time to be like, how am I going to create a whole different learning opportunity for this kid?
For each person. Yeah.
Each person. That's why I do think that it really comes down to parents. You had this kid, you should give a shit about them. And I know there's people working 2 jobs and they're trying to survive. Their brains are in survival mode.
Well, they shouldn't have had the fucking kid.
Yeah, that's a whole another podcast. But yeah, I think it comes down to parents being like, okay, my fucking kid sucks at reading. Obviously, I need to be able to get him to read to a certain point where like he can function in day-to-day society. But we're not going to do To Kill a Mockingbird today, right? Like, we're going to figure out what they're good at. Let's say, take Bruce Lee, for example. Oh, you can never sit down? How else can we educate you or develop skills that will be useful for you as a human?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it goes back to one of the most famous TED Talks of all time, and I forget who the guy was, but he was basically like talking about like education differently. We're talking like this is something that was out in like I think 2013 or something like that. But like these people thought like their daughter was retarded, and they took her to like this psychologist, whatever, and he's talking to the girl, whatever, and all this other stuff, and like she can't stop like tapping her feet or whatever. And then the psychologist like leaves the office, like leaving the radio on or something like that to keep her company, goes outside, and him and the parents can see in, that she can't see out, and she's moving despite being like really young perfectly to the beat. And he said, your daughter isn't disabled, she's a dancer.
Yep.
But people are not willing to accept that, because it's like, well, then what is she going to do for a job? You know what I mean? And it's like, well, she could become a fucking dancer. You know what I mean?
That's such a narrow mindset. Well, what are they going to do for a job? You know what?
Need to get a real job.
I understand that people need to be able to like be a contributing member of society, but there's many ways to do that. And we have this weird hyperfixation that like the way to do that is to graduate high school and go to college and get expensive / useless degrees and
Right.
like make America, the
Great again.
Well, like
I don't. Yeah,
yeah.
I don't have an ideological fixation.
Right.
It was just a funny pun to me.
Right, but it's kind of true. Like that slogan aside, that's the goal, right? We should have the top scientists and the top this and the top that, and
right.
Your kid needs to be part of that. It's such bullshit. And if I had realized what bullshit it was when I was like 18, I think my life would have looked a lot different. And I don't blame anyone for that, because I love the way everything's ended up. It's great. But at the same time, it's such a narrow viewpoint. Like it's such a narrow band of and very specific of like, you need to do XYZ to be a successful human, period. So anyone that doesn't fit that mold feels like they suck all the time. Why would you try if that was the case, right? Like, it's stupid. I had a friend of mine say, I don't want to go back to working in a grocery store because I just feel like it's an embarrassing job to have. And I was like, Bitch, grocery store managers make like well into the six figures a year. Like you can make big money
Really?
working in grocery.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
but if now you know. You ever want to go work in a
And
grocery
knowing is
store?
half the battle.
Right, but like there's a weird shame attached to certain jobs because they're like not good enough, but also what make the fucking world go round at the same time, right? Like, so I don't know. I just like all this to say we don't, even though we do try to in many instances, we don't cater or even focus on people's strengths if they have weaknesses. And
Well,
that,
yeah.
yeah,
And that's the thing about it all. As someone who like has like an understanding of mindset and things like that, and neediness and scarcity, as it's often like referred to in business. And then you realize that like when you're saying, it's like, oh, like, but we need to have the best this or we need to have the best that. It isn't even about like devaluing people's lives and just turning them into, oh, you're just a figurehead to be like so we can be the best at something. It's the neediness of it. Because if you really wanted the best scientist, the best, whatever, you would do what you were just talking about, where you would have a like a like so deep matrix and like complex of different like ways of evaluating people's strengths in order to like cultivate this or that, it would be AI learning essentially, like how to maximize human development or something like that.
yeah.
Like that, even if you were just like not caring about like who people actually wanted to be or like their souls or whatever it is you want to, like that is how you would actually get that. So it's not even, it's like I've always said, like, well, not like I regularly say, is that like if you're gonna rob a bank, or if you're gonna steal, or if you're gonna kill somebody or whatever, at least have the self-respect to try to get away with it. You
I
know what I
mean, you're
mean?
not
Like,
wrong. Yeah.
there's ethics, and then there's just plain doing your job well. And I'm just saying, like, you know, if you're going to like not care about people's lives or them feeling horrible or whatever, at least make them the best version of this freaking zombie creature you're creating possible, you
And
know?
I couldn't agree with you more, honestly, dude. And like, obviously, I love psychology, and I did enjoy certain parts of my job as a psychologist. But I think, like, if I had to summarize your main point, it's that psychology really is like not looking at the full picture when we're offering a diagnosis. Um, and like I would also argue after this conversation, like how cool would it be to have the opposite of a mental illness and have like a, a diagnostic manual for super strength, like when we're talking about your friend Adam, our mutual friend Adam.
Equality, we can't make anybody stand out because then everybody else will feel bad about themselves. Not that
Why?
that, but,
We're saying people are disordered. We can't say that they're
oh,
the
but
opposite of
it's
disordered.
not their fault, Chrislyn. They just they're just sick. They just have an illness. It's not. But see that again, like that's what it comes back to. It's like just kind of that narrative that like we're mocking as we're talking about it. Like exactly why can't and that's another reason like we think, oh, like scarcity mindset focuses on the negative. What does society universally focus on? The negative.
Well, but back to our main point of the podcast. What are our bait? Oh my god! What are our brains primed to look for first? The
Right.
negative,
Yeah, so it can
and that's a
survive.
survival instinct,
Yeah.
right? Like,
So maybe it's society that hasn't evolved. Maybe society is the one that has the disorder.
I like thinking of it like that. That would
Think
be
about
great.
it. Like even even its ability to maximize uh, manipulating people and such is minimized by its kind of incompetence because it doesn't have the awareness to think of like here's this matrix of different like AI learning capabilities we could have to maximize like the value of our workforce in whatever regard. Like even if you just see them as worker ants, like it's still falling through. No matter how you look at it, society is just doing okay. And
Oh
even
yeah,
even that is being optimistic,
yeah.
you
I
know.
agreed. 1,000,000% agreed.
And so, yeah, I think a big part of it is like, and like we talked about before last night about how like if you know if a soldier's in wartime and all these things are going on, their brain adapts to that situation because the brain does not have a perception of time. We consciously do, but the brain, like at those levels where it's encoding those things, is just saying like, this is a threat. This is how you get away from it. Done. Here's another threat. Here's how you get away from it. Done. Oh, this is really scary. Okay, we're going to make sure that any tiny hint of this happening is going to immediately get us the hell out of Dodge because we can't be around for that. And then, oh, your tour's up. Welcome home. Oh, you don't work perfectly according to what we want now. You have PTSD. And it's like even just the notion of sending somebody from normal society into a wartime effort and everything that's entailed with that is honestly cruel in its own right. Because first of all, it's unrealistic to take them from normalcy, put them into wartime, and then have them come back and expect them to be normal. But it's also like completely irresponsible. And of course, like that would also get into, okay, you would need to raise people specifically to be warriors or whatever. But it's like the point being is that, you create a situation where somebody who their life is not preparing them for the intensity of this situation. Like going to boot camp is not going to make them, completely infallible for this. And then they go there and they get fucked up because they're still, most people their age or whatever are, working as a mechanic and like going to the movies or watching Netflix with their girlfriend or boyfriend on the weekend. Like that is what their life was building up to. And now this buddy who helped them get through basic training by carrying him to the finish line just got blown to pieces and they're supposed to be okay with it.
Yeah.
Again, it's society that is showing that it's insane by expecting people to just go into the meat grinder and come out without a scratch.
Yeah. But also, here's a GI Bill so you can go to college because you'll be able to do that with all your PTSD.
Right.
And like you can live your life after this. You know what I mean? When it's like, I don't, we don't, people are disposable in our society, right? Like it's like you were saying, we put them in the meat grinder. It's sad. And I think the only way that you can sort of fight the good fight is to well, a couple things. If you choose to have kids, keep all of this shit in mind, right? But also to your point of like, I determine my own worth. I like the idea of pretending that I am a blade of grass in a fucking field because no one gives a shit. Just there with all the other blades of grass, trying to get some sunshine and some dewdrops and just fucking hang out, right? Because that's all any of us are in the end.
Yeah, it's if a meteor came and hit the planet, I usually use this example, and we all died. The solar system, much less the galaxy, much less the universe, would not be adversely affected. And the extent to which that makes somebody's value of life insignificant, like severely affects people's egos, which is where I think the majority of all these issues come from. And that's why it can't be true.
Yeah.
But your ego could tell you that you can flap your arms to fly, doesn't make it true. And so people pretend like they can ignore something into reality, and it's just not the case. And that I think more than anything else is the disorder, whatever, that has ultimately encouraged the different disorders or the mass shootings and stuff like that. Is society and people as a whole are refusing to accept responsibility of looking at things as they are rather than throwing stones at it by making it something that is drastically different from them. They could never be like that, never.
Yeah.
And the reality is that the vast majority of people are only one bad day or good day, because again, positives
Yeah.
away from, at least in theory, like being drastically different.
Yeah.
But they're never going to know because they never get a chance. And yeah. So I guess kind of like I like to have like a takeaway from like the general idea that I talk about. It's like, if somebody has like a characteristic that they find like generally completely weighs them down, like even you like with your anxiety, like you've also had to realize that like it makes you aware of like literally every possible fucking thing that could go wrong. Well, guess what? You're not going to get blindsided by things as much because you've already obsessed over every single thing that could go wrong and things that will never go wrong, but just might go wrong. So you're basically perfect for an operations role or something like that because
Yeah.
nothing's going to get past you. It is pretty much like it is pathologically impossible.
Yeah, play up to your strengths, right?
Right. And acknowledge that something that you may have seen as a weakness could very much be made to be a strength. Uh, but you can't do that unless you choose to see it that way. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand is that it's an element of your identity, not a disorder of your mind.
I like that a lot. An element of your identity.
Right. And I'm not even saying that to be politically correct.
No, but it's a lovely way of thinking of it, right?
Right. So yeah, I mean that's what kind of occurs to me is like the summation. Like, was there anything else that like was, rolling around in your mind? I don't want to be the only person who has the final.
No, I think that was a really good summary of it all. Because even in a non-cheesy way, like we want to be positive, like life is balanced. It might not look that way a lot, but like really we live in a pretty, good things happen, bad things happen, like all these things. You have good characteristics, you have bad characteristics. There's outliers, of course, in anything, but if we can just remember that like we're not special, so that's amazing that we're not special, or that most of us aren't. And like look at it from that perspective, I probably have just as many good things as bad things. It's actually kind of relieving. So that's my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, it's like there is not like some predefined image that you need to fit, and if you don't, then there's something. Yeah, again, like you're not living up to your potential or whatever because you decide what your potential is and what that's supposed to look like and such.
Exactly.
So, cool. So this was the Outcast Intellectual Podcast, typically hosted at 10 a.m. Eastern Freedom Time. And thank you. Oh, I remember, I forgot.